At 75, Wilbur Daniels, a Vietnam veteran, could never have foreseen how diving into the churning waters of Fox River Reservoir would change his life forever. He had heard the desperate cries amidst the worst storm Forestdale County had witnessed in decades. Despite arthritic hands and a body weathered by 50 years of toiling on the land, Wilbur, against all odds, managed to rescue 12-year-old William Morgan from certain death. He pulled the billionaire's son from beneath the capsized boat, swimming him through white-capped waves to the safety of the shore. A week later, as Wilbur sat at his kitchen table, the final foreclosure notice for Twin Oaks Farm, land his family had worked for 3 generations, lay before him. Its stark reality was suddenly interrupted by the distant rumble of engines, shattering the morning silence. He looked up, watching in disbelief as 10 black luxury SUVs, kicking up dust that glowed golden in the morning light, slowly wound their way up his dirt driveway. What tech mogul Theodore Morgan offered Wilbur that morning would not only transform his failing farm, but also challenge everything the proud, solitary farmer believed about progress, family, and finding purpose in the twilight of his years. The morning sun cast long shadows across Twin Oaks Farm as Wilbur Daniels trudged from the chicken coop to the weathered barn, a structure that had stood for over a century. His hands, calloused and gnarled from decades of hard labor, carried a pail of feed, his loyal border collie, Scout, trotting faithfully at his heels. At 75, every step Wilbur took was met with his body's protest. Arthritis gnawed at his joints, a persistent winter chill that seemed to have permanently settled in his bones. The sprawling 300-acre property had belonged to the Daniels family for 3 generations. Yet these days, Wilbur worked it entirely alone. On his mantelpiece, a framed photograph had yellowed with age, much like the memories it preserved. Wilbur, his late wife Eleanor, and their daughter Patricia standing proudly before a bountiful harvest. Patricia had left for Seattle 15 years prior, pursuing a career in agricultural science, a life far removed from the rhythms of their rural existence. Eleanor, his beloved wife, had succumbed to cancer 7 years ago, leaving Wilbur with only the land and his stubborn determination to maintain it. "Come on, old girl," Wilbur murmured to the ancient tractor, clearly a machine that had seen better days. Its engine sputtered reluctantly before finally catching, its familiar rumble offering a small comfort in the solitude of the vast fields. From his elevated position on the tractor, Wilbur surveyed his property. The north field urgently needed attention. The irrigation system was failing yet again, and the barn roof, he knew, wouldn't survive another winter. These were problems that demanded money he simply didn't possess. Later that same afternoon, Wilbur sat at his kitchen table. Bills were spread before him, laid out like a losing hand of cards. The foreclosure notice from Grandview Savings and Loan bore yesterday's date, 30. Days to come up with $120,000 or lose everything his family had built. Wilbur removed his wire-rimmed glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, the crushing weight of failure pressing down on him. The shrill ring of the telephone pierced the silence. Wilbur rarely received calls these days. "Daniels," he answered, his voice gruff from disuse. "Wilbur, it's Rick. You watching the weather forecast?" Rick Stevens, Wilbur's neighbor for nearly 4 decades, whose farm bordered Twin Oaks to the west, sounded urgent. "Not particularly. Why?" "Big storm coming in tonight. They're saying it could be the worst we've had in years. Flash flood warnings all over the county. Thought you should know, especially with that section of your east pasture that always floods." Wilbur frowned, glancing out the window at the darkening sky. "Appreciate the heads up. I'll move the equipment to higher ground. Need any help? I could send my boy over. I'll manage." Wilbur's pride wouldn't allow him to accept help, not even now. After hanging up, Wilbur walked to the front porch, Scout following close behind. The air felt heavy with impending rain, the distinctive pressure drop that always preceded a significant storm. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, still distant, but moving quickly. He had a few hours at most to prepare. Despite his aching joints, Wilbur worked with efficient haste, moving vulnerable equipment to higher ground, securing loose items around the farm, and reinforcing the temporary patches on the barn roof. Scout stayed close, sensing her master's concern, occasionally whining at the approaching storm. "We've weathered worse, girl," Wilbur assured her, though even he wasn't entirely convinced. By dusk, the wind had picked up significantly, bending the tall pines that lined the edge of the property. The first heavy raindrops began to fall as Wilbur completed his preparations, each one striking the dry ground with an audible force. He was headed toward the house when a flash of lightning illuminated the entire landscape, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Scout pressed against his leg, trembling slightly. "Inside, girl. Let's go." They had barely reached the shelter of the porch when the skies opened, releasing a torrent of rain that reduced visibility to mere feet. Wilbur stood for a moment watching the deluge with growing unease. The forecast had not exaggerated. This was indeed a powerful storm. Throughout the evening, Wilbur monitored the storm's progress from his windows, checking for leaks and listening to the emergency radio for updates. The power flickered several times before failing completely around 9 p.m., plunging the farmhouse into darkness, relieved only by the warm glow of the kerosene lamps Wilbur always kept ready. Near midnight, when the storm was at its height, Scout suddenly stood alert, ears perked toward the east. A low growl rumbled in the dog's throat. "What is it, girl?" Wilbur peered into the rain-lashed darkness, seeing nothing but sheets of water illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning. Scout growled again, more insistent this time, moving to the door with obvious agitation. "All right, let's take a look." Wilbur reached for his heavy rain slicker and an old but reliable flashlight. "Not that we'll see much in this mess." Opening the door released the full fury of the storm into the small entryway, wind driving rain horizontally across the porch. Wilbur hesitated, the rational part of his mind questioning the wisdom of venturing out, but Scout's unusual behavior was enough to overcome his reservations. The border collie had an uncanny sense for trouble. Securing his slicker and pulling on rubber boots, Wilbur stepped into the storm, instantly soaked despite his protection. Scout darted ahead, pausing to ensure her master followed, then continued east toward Fox River Reservoir, a large body of water that bordered part of Wilbur's property. "Scout, get back here," Wilbur called, his voice lost in the howling wind. There was nothing to be done but follow. The journey to the reservoir was treacherous. The ground was slick with mud and debris, visibility reduced to the small cone of light from his flashlight. Wilbur slipped several times, each fall sending jolts of pain through his aging joints. But something in Scout's urgency propelled him forward. When they reached the ridge overlooking Fox River Reservoir, Wilbur understood. The usually calm water had been transformed into a churning maelstrom, waves cresting and breaking against the shore with violent force. And there, caught in the tempest, was a small boat, capsized, its occupants struggling in the water. Wilbur's heart hammered in his chest. Even from this distance, he could see it was a child and an adult. Their desperate thrashing barely kept them above the surface. Without conscious thought, he was moving, scrambling down the steep path to the shore, Scout racing ahead. At the water's edge, Wilbur could hear the panicked cries more clearly. The adult, a man, was calling to the child, trying to reach him, but clearly struggling himself. "Hold on!" Wilbur shouted, doubting they could hear him over the storm. "I'm coming!" The momentary clarity of purpose that had driven him to the shore faltered as he faced the grim reality of the rescue. At 75, with arthritis and decades-old injuries from his time in Vietnam, swimming in calm water was challenging enough. In this tempest, it bordered on suicidal. But there was no one else. No time to run for help. No passing boats or nearby cabins. Just Wilbur Daniels, an old farmer with bad knees and a lifetime of regrets. "Stay, Scout," he commanded, fixing the dog with a stern look before wading into the frigid water. The shock of the cold nearly took his breath away, quickly followed by the powerful tug of currents he hadn't anticipated. Summoning strength from some long-dormant reserve, Wilbur pushed forward, swimming toward the capsized boat where the child clung precariously to the overturned hull. "I've got you," he called as he approached. "Let go and come to me." The boy, no more than 12, Wilbur guessed, looked at him with terror-filled eyes, frozen in place by fear or cold or both. "You have to let go, son." Wilbur was alongside now, reaching for the boy. "Trust me." Another wave crashed over them, and the boy lost his grip on the boat, disappearing beneath the dark water. Without hesitation, Wilbur dove after him, fighting against the current, his lungs burning as he searched the murky depths. His hand connected with fabric, and he pulled, using the last of his strength to bring the child to the surface. They broke through together, the boy gasping and coughing, Wilbur blinking water from his eyes as he secured his arm around the child's waist. "I've got you," he repeated. "I've got you." The swim back to shore was a blur of exhaustion and determination. At some point, Wilbur realized the father had managed to reach them, helping to support the boy as they fought their way through the waves. When they finally reached the shallows, all three collapsed onto the muddy shore, the storm still raging around them. Scout barked frantically, circling them as they lay gasping on the ground. Wilbur's entire body screamed with pain, his lungs raw from exertion and inhaled water. "My son," the man beside him panted, still gripping the boy's hand. "You saved my son." Wilbur couldn't respond, focusing instead on drawing oxygen into his burning chest. After several moments, he managed to push himself to a sitting position, assessing their situation. They couldn't stay here. The storm showed no signs of abating, and now they were all at risk of hypothermia. "My farm," he finally managed to voice. "Not far. Can you walk?" The man nodded, gathering his son into his arms, despite his own obvious exhaustion. "Lead the way." The journey back to Twin Oaks Farm seemed twice as long, each step a monumental effort. The boy had regained consciousness but remained limp in his father's arms, occasionally coughing up water. When the farmhouse finally came into view, Wilbur felt a relief so profound his knees nearly buckled. Inside, Wilbur moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to emergencies. He built up the fire in the old wood stove, provided dry clothes, his own, far too large, but better than their sodden alternatives, and prepared hot tea, sweetened liberally with honey. Only when the boy was wrapped in blankets near the stove, color returning to his pale face, did Wilbur finally address their unexpected guests properly. "Wilbur Daniels," he said simply, extending a hand to the father. "Theodore Morgan," the man replied, his handshake firm despite his exhaustion. "And this is my son, William. I don't have words to thank you, Mr. Daniels. What you did tonight," he faltered, emotion overcoming him as he glanced at his son. Wilbur waved away the thanks, uncomfortable with gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. Theodore Morgan shook his head slowly. "No, sir, they wouldn't have." "What were you even doing out in this storm?" Nodded toward Scout, who had stationed herself protectively beside William. She knew. Dogs have a sense about these things. "You get some rest now. Storm should pass by morning, then we'll figure out how to get you back to wherever you came from." Later, as the guests slept, Theodore on the couch, William in Wilbur's own bed, while the old farmer made do with his recliner, Wilbur reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought these strangers to his home on this particular night. Tomorrow they would leave, returning to lives he knew nothing about, and he would face his foreclosure notice and failing farm alone once more. But for tonight, Twin Oaks Farm had served its purpose as a haven, just as it had for generations of Daniels before him. Outside, the storm gradually relented, its fury spent against the resilient landscape of Forestdale County. Wilbur dozed fitfully, his body aching from the evening's exertion, unaware that the ripples from this night's events would soon return to transform his life in ways he could never imagine. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, as if nature was making amends for the previous night's fury. Wilbur woke stiff and sore, every muscle protesting the previous night's exertion. The events at Fox River Reservoir seemed almost dreamlike in the morning light, but the presence of his unexpected guests confirmed the reality. Theodore Morgan was already awake, standing at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee he'd prepared himself. He turned as Wilbur entered, his expression difficult to read. "I hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to the coffee pot. "Didn't want to wake you." Wilbur shook his head. "Help yourself." He poured his own cup, the familiar ritual grounding him in normalcy despite the unusual circumstances. "How's the boy? Still sleeping?" "He was exhausted, but his breathing is normal." "No fever!" Theodore's relief was palpable. "I called for a car. Should be here within the hour." Wilbur nodded, unsurprised by the news of their imminent departure. People like the Morgans didn't linger in places like Twin Oaks Farm. Roads might still be rough after the storm. They'll manage. The driver knows the area. Theodore hesitated, clearly weighing his next words. "Mr. Daniels, Wilbur, I owe you a debt I can never repay. If there's anything you need, anything at all." Wilbur cut him off with a shake of his head. "Don't need payment for doing what's right." He took a sip of his coffee, avoiding the intensity of Theodore's gaze. "You'd have done the same." "I'd like to think so." Theodore's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "But the fact remains. You saved my son's life. I won't forget that." They lapsed into silence, drinking their coffee as the morning light strengthened. Scout entered from the living room, followed by a sleepy-eyed William, his small bit frame swallowed by one of Wilbur's old flannel shirts. "Morning," Wilbur greeted the boy. "How you feeling, son?" William looked up at him with solemn eyes. "Better, sir. Thank you for saving me." The simple, direct gratitude caught Wilbur off guard. "You're welcome," he replied, his usual gruffness softening. "You're a strong swimmer. That helped." The boy's face brightened slightly at the praise. "My mom taught me. She said everyone should know how to swim." A shadow crossed Theodore's face at the mention of William's mother, a grief so familiar that Wilbur recognized it instantly. The same shadow that had haunted his own reflection for 7 years. "Your mom was right," Wilbur said, filling the awkward silence. "Smart woman." The remainder of the Morgans' stay passed quietly. William asked to see the farm animals, a request Wilbur granted despite his aching body. The boy's genuine interest in the chickens and Scout's herding abilities brought a reluctant smile to the old farmer's face. There was something refreshing about the child's enthusiasm, so different from the jaded disinterest Wilbur had grown accustomed to from his rare visitors. When a sleek black SUV with tinted windows appeared on the dirt driveway, precisely an hour after Theodore's call, Wilbur felt an unexpected twinge of regret. The Morgans would return to their world, and he to his separate orbits that had briefly, improbably intersected. "Our ride is here," Theodore announced unnecessarily, gathering the few possessions they'd managed to recover from the reservoir. He extended his hand to Wilbur. "I meant what I said earlier. If you ever need anything—" Wilbur shook the offered hand. "We're square, Mr. Morgan. Just glad the boy's all right." William approached, Scout following attentively at his heels. The boy knelt to hug the border collie, whispering something in the dog's ear that made her tail wag furiously. "Can I come back sometime?" William asked, looking up at Wilbur with hopeful eyes. "To see Scout and the chickens?" Before Wilbur could formulate a response, Theodore placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Mr. Daniels is busy running his farm, William. We shouldn't impose." "The boy's welcome," Wilbur found himself saying, surprising even himself. "Scout would like that." The smile that lit William's face was worth the momentary departure from Wilbur's usual reticence. The boy waved goodbye from the SUV's window as they pulled away, Scout barking a farewell from the porch steps. As the vehicle disappeared down the long driveway, Wilbur turned back to his empty house. The silence suddenly more noticeable than before. The foreclosure notice still waited on the kitchen table, the farm's problems unchanged by the night's dramatic events. With a sigh, he returned to the reality of his situation, beginning the day's chores despite his protesting muscles. The storm had caused significant damage across the property. A section of fencing in the east pasture had collapsed under a fallen tree. The chicken coop roof had partially caved in, and the already precarious barn roof now sported several new leaks. Hours of labor lay ahead, with supplies he could ill afford. By mid-afternoon, Wilbur had made what temporary repairs he could, prioritizing the animal shelter over his own comfort. He was clearing debris from around the barn when Sheriff Jack Wilson's patrol car pulled up beside the house. "Afternoon, Wilbur," Jack called, stepping out of the vehicle. He surveyed the storm damage with a practiced eye. "Looks like you got hit pretty hard." "Seen worse," Wilbur replied, leaning on his shovel. He and Jack had a complicated history, having grown up as neighbors before taking vastly different paths. Jack to college and law enforcement, Wilbur to Vietnam, and then back to the family farm. They'd maintained a relationship over the decades, one that wasn't quite friendship, but contained mutual respect. "Heard you had some excitement last night?" Jack continued, approaching with the deliberate casualness of a man leading up to something. "Beyond the usual storm troubles," Wilbur's eyes narrowed. "News travels fast. Theodore Morgan called the station this morning. Wanted to officially thank the department for their assistance." Jack's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Had to tell him we had nothing to do with the rescue. That it was all Wilbur Daniels, local, Akahiro." Wilbur scowled at the term. "Just happened to be in the right place. Because your dog led you there in the middle of a hurricane-force storm." Jack shook his head in admiration. "Most folks would have stayed put. Called it in. Maybe not waded into that reservoir." "You know who he is, Morgan?" Wilbur asked, changing the subject away from his actions. Jack's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You don't?" When Wilbur shook his head, Jack let out a low whistle. "Theodore Morgan is the founder and CEO of Morgan Innovations, a tech company worth billions. The man's one of the richest people in the country." This information settled uncomfortably in Wilbur's mind. He'd recognized that the Morgans were wealthy. The expensive watch on Theodore's wrist, the tailored quality of the clothes that had been ruined in the storm, the ease with which he summoned a car to this remote location. But billions was a scale of wealth beyond Wilbur's comprehension. "Explains a few things," he muttered. "Like why half the state police and a private security team were ready to tear apart the county looking for him and his son." Jack agreed. "Morgan called them off when he realized you'd brought them safely to your farm." "They were just people in trouble," Wilbur said firmly. "Wouldn't have mattered if they were billionaires or broke." Jack's expression softened. "I know that, Wilbur. It's why I've always respected you." He glanced around at the storm damage again. "You need any help with all this? I'm off duty in an hour. Could round up some volunteers from town." Pride warred with practicality in Wilbur's mind. The damage was extensive beyond what he could repair alone, especially in his current physical state. But accepting help had never come easily to him, particularly since Eleanor's death. "I'll manage," he said finally, the same response he always gave. Jack sighed, recognizing the familiar stubbornness. "Offer stands if you change your mind." He turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, Morgan asked for a lot of information about you. Property records, family history, that sort of thing." Wilbur frowned. "Why would he do that?" "Don't know," Jack admitted. "But a man like that, with those kinds of resources, doesn't usually take an interest in someone without a reason." With a final nod, the sheriff returned to his patrol car, leaving Wilbur with more questions than answers. The rest of the week passed in a blur of physical labor and mounting financial worry. The bank called twice, their polite inquiries about the foreclosure payment thinly veiling the reality that Twin Oaks Farm would soon change hands. Wilbur avoided town, unwilling to face the inevitable questions about the rescue, or worse, pitying looks from those who knew about his financial situation. On Sunday morning, he finally ventured into Grand View for supplies. The small town had changed little in his lifetime, maintaining its single main street lined with family-owned businesses despite the encroachment of chain stores in neighboring communities. Wilbur parked his battered truck in front of Riverside Hardware, mentally calculating the minimum supplies he needed and could afford. "Well, look who it is." Tim Riverside, the hardware store's third-generation owner, greeted him with unusual enthusiasm. The hero of Fox River Reservoir himself. Wilbur suppressed a groan. "Need some roofing nails and patching material, Tim?" Tim either missed or ignored Wilbur's desire to avoid the topic. "Whole town's talking about it, Wilbur. Diving into that water during the worst storm in 20 years at your age? Remarkable." "Just did what needed doing," Wilbur replied, examining a package of nails with unnecessary intensity. "And modest, too. But you saved Theodore Morgan's son, Wilbur. That's not nothing." Tim leaned across the counter conspiratorially. "Heard the man's worth over $10 billion. Founded that tech company that makes the smartphones everyone uses." Wilbur placed the nails on the counter. "Need that roof patch too, Tim?" Recognizing he wouldn't get the dramatic retelling he'd hoped for, Tim retrieved the patching material. "You know, lot of storm damage around. I'm running a special on repair supplies this week, 10% off for cash customers." It was a kindness thinly disguised as business, and both men knew it. Wilbur nodded his thanks, paying for the supplies with carefully counted bills from his worn wallet. As he loaded the purchases into his truck, Mary Edwards from the town library approached, her silver hair neatly styled despite the Sunday hour. "Wilbur Daniels," she called, a determined gleam in her eye. "Don't you dare drive off before saying hello." Wilbur suppressed a sigh. Mary had been Eleanor's close friend, and since his wife's passing, she'd appointed herself as his occasional social conscience, periodically appearing with books she insisted he would enjoy, or updates on town affairs he pretended not to care about. "Morning, Mary." "Morning." "Indeed. I've been trying to call you for days." Her reproach was gentle but firm. "Your phone working when it wants to?" The landline at the farm was as temperamental as the tractor. Mary studied him with the perceptive gaze that had intimidated generations of library patrons. "You look tired, Wilbur. More than usual." "Been busy." "Yes, rescuing billionaires and repairing storm damage, I heard." Her expression softened. "Eleanor would have been proud. You know what you did at the reservoir?" The mention of his late wife pierced Wilbur's carefully maintained defenses. "She would have given me hell for risking my neck," he corrected. But there was no heat in his words. Eleanor would indeed have scolded him, but with the same fierce love that had sustained him for 43 years of marriage. Mary smiled, acknowledging the truth in his statement. "Have you heard from Patricia?" The question was like touching a bruise, painful but impossible to ignore. "No." His relationship with his only child had deteriorated steadily after Eleanor's death. Their infrequent communication now reduced to Christmas cards and occasional terse phone calls. "She should know what you did," Mary insisted. "I could call her if—" "Leave it be, Mary." Wilbur's tone made it clear the subject was closed. "Patricia has her own life, doesn't need updates on mine." Mary sighed, but respected the boundary. "At least come by the library sometime. I've got a new biography of that general you admire." Wilbur nodded, not committing but appreciating the gesture. After a few more minutes of conversation, Mary providing town updates, Wilbur offering monosyllabic responses, they parted ways, and Wilbur headed back to the solitude of Twin Oaks Farm. As he crested the final hill before his property, Wilbur was met with an unexpected sight. A line of black SUVs, he counted 10 in total, was parked in formation before his farmhouse. Men in suits stood beside several of the vehicles while others appeared to be surveying the property. Wilbur brought his truck to an abrupt halt. Surprise quickly giving way to weary suspicion. His first thought was that the bank had somehow accelerated the foreclosure process, sending representatives to assess the property before the official takeover. But the vehicles were too high-end, the personnel too numerous for a simple bank action. As he approached slowly, one of the SUV's doors opened, and Theodore Morgan emerged, dressed impeccably, in what appeared to be casual attire, but which Wilbur suspected cost more than his monthly farm expenses. William followed, his face lighting up at the sight of Wilbur's truck. "Mr. Daniels," the boy called, waving enthusiastically. Scout, who had Talita dem Amis or SIDA. Ham on a Mahad's raised, and I let it made friends with the visitors, bounded toward Wilbur's truck, barking and greeting. Wilbur parked and stepped out, confusion evident in his weathered face. "Miss Morgan, didn't expect to see you again." Theodore approached, extending his hand. "I apologize for the surprise visit. I would have called ahead, but—" He gestured toward the farmhouse, implying his awareness of the unreliable phone service. "What brings you back to Twin Oaks?" Wilbur asked, directly as always. Theodore smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression that hadn't been there during their first meeting. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Daniels, one I believe could benefit us both." He gestured toward the house. "May we go inside to discuss it?" Wilbur hesitated, glancing at the assembled vehicles and personnel. "Seems like an awful lot of people for a conversation." "They're my team," Theodore explained. "Experts in various fields relevant to what I'm proposing. But the conversation can start with just us, if you prefer." William had reached them by now, Scout circling excitedly at his feet. "I told Dad, your farm is the best place I've ever been," the boy announced. "Even better than our house in Aspen." Despite his weariness, Wilbur felt his resolve softening at the child's evident enthusiasm. "Farm's seen better days," he said honestly. "But it's home." Theodore's expression turned serious. "And I'd like to help ensure it stays that way, Mr. Daniels, if you'll hear me out." Wilbur considered the man before him, wealthy beyond comprehension, powerful in ways Wilbur could barely imagine, yet standing on his dusty driveway with what appeared to be genuine respect. Whatever Theodore Morgan was offering, it would at least be worth hearing. "Come on in, then," he finally said, leading the way to the farmhouse. "Can't guarantee the coffee is any good, but it's hot." Behind him, Theodore signaled to his team, who remained by the vehicles, as father and son followed Wilbur into the house that was about to become the setting for a conversation that would change everything. Inside the farmhouse, Wilbur moved with the economical efficiency of someone accustomed to solitude, setting a pot of coffee to brew while Theodore and William settled at the kitchen table. The room's simplicity stood in stark contrast to what Wilbur imagined was the Morgans' usual environment. Worn linoleum floors, cabinets that had been painted and repainted over decades, appliances that predated most of Theodore's wealth. "Nice kitchen," William commented, his eyes drawn to the collection of carved wooden birds that lined a shelf above the sink. Eleanor's collection, which Wilbur had maintained as faithfully as he maintained the farm itself. "Been the same since before you were born," Wilbur replied, setting mugs on the table. He poured coffee for himself and Theodore, and found a carton of orange juice in the refrigerator for William. "Your father said something about a proposition." Theodore nodded, taking a sip of the coffee without comment on its quality. "I'll be direct, Mr. Daniels." I've done some research on Twin Oaks Farm since our last meeting. I know about the foreclosure notice. I know that agricultural operations of this size are increasingly difficult to maintain without substantial capital investment. And I know that this land has been in your family for generations. Wilbur's expression remained impassive, though his grip on his mug tightened slightly. You've been thorough. I make it a point to understand situations fully before proposing solutions, Theodore replied evenly. What I'm about to suggest isn't charity, Mr. Daniels. It's a business proposition that I believe would benefit us both while preserving the legacy of Twin Oaks Farm. I'm listening. Theodore leaned forward slightly. Morgan Innovations has been developing sustainable agriculture technologies for the past 5 years. Advanced irrigation systems, soil monitoring equipment, crop optimization software. We've had success in controlled environments, but we need real-world testing grounds. Farmland with history, with established soil patterns, with experienced management. Understanding dawned on Wilbur. You want to use Twin Oaks as a test site? I want to transform Twin Oaks into a showcase for the future of family farming, Theodore corrected. A working research center that demonstrates how traditional agricultural practices can be enhanced, not replaced, by thoughtful technology integration. Wilbur's skepticism was evident. And what happens to me in this scenario? You buy the farm and keep the old farmer around as some kind of mascot? William looked alarmed at the harshness in Wilbur's tone, but Theodore seemed to have anticipated the reaction. Quite the opposite, he replied calmly. The farm would remain yours. Morgan Innovations would fund the immediate payment of the foreclosure amount, plus establish an operational fund for ongoing improvements. You would continue to manage the property with advisory support from our agricultural team. In return, we would use portions of the land, perhaps 30% initially, for our research programs. He paused, allowing Wilbur to process this information. You wouldn't be an employee, Mr. Daniels. You'd be a partner. Wilbur set his mug down carefully, years of practice hiding the tremor that had developed in his hands. Why? Why this farm? Why me? There must be hundreds of struggling family farms you could choose from. Theodore glanced at William, who was watching their exchange with intense interest. Several reasons. The soil composition here is ideal for our research parameters. The property's size and layout provide the variety of conditions we need. Its proximity to water sources is advantageous. He hesitated, then added, And I believe in repaying debts, Mr. Daniels. You saved my son's life. That creates a connection, whether you acknowledge it or not. I told you before I don't need payment for that. It's not payment, Theodore insisted. It's recognition of character. The man who would dive into a flooded reservoir during a storm to save strangers is precisely the kind of partner Morgan Innovations values. Wilbur's discomfort with praise was evident in his posture. Still leaves a lot of questions. What kind of technologies are we talking about? What happens to the parts of the farm not used for your research? And what happens when your company loses interest or finds something shinier to pursue? Theodore smiled, apparently pleased by the practical nature of these questions. I'd like to introduce you to someone who can address those concerns more specifically. He stood and moved to the door, signaling to one of the people waiting outside. Moments later, a woman in her early 40s entered the kitchen. She wore practical clothes, khaki pants, a button-down shirt, and boots that had clearly seen actual use, and carried a tablet and several folders. Her demeanor was professional but approachable, lacking the corporate slickness Wilbur had expected. "Mr. Daniels, this is Dr. Sophia Williams, Morgan Innovations' Chief Sustainability Officer. She oversees all of our agricultural initiatives." Dr. Williams extended her hand. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Daniels. My grandfather ran a dairy farm in Wisconsin, so I have immense respect for what you've accomplished here." Wilbur shook her hand, noting the calluses that suggested she wasn't just a desk scientist. "You're the expert, then? On the technical aspects?" "Yes," she acknowledged, taking the seat Theodore offered. "Though I suspect no one is more expert on Twin Oaks Farm than yourself." This small acknowledgement of his expertise softened Wilbur's expression slightly. "What exactly does Morgan Innovations want to do to my farm?" Dr. Williams opened one of her folders, revealing detailed maps of the property that must have been compiled from county records. "With your permission, we'd like to implement several complementary systems across selected portions of the property. Advanced drip irrigation in the eastern fields, which our surveys indicate have historically struggled with proper water distribution. Soil nutrient monitoring in the north and west sections, allowing for targeted minimal fertilizer application rather than broad coverage. And a small greenhouse complex near the old orchard for controlled comparative studies." The level of research they had already conducted was both impressive and slightly unsettling to Wilbur. "You've been busy," he observed. "Preliminary assessments only," she assured him. "Nothing would proceed without your full involvement and approval." She turned to another page in her folder. "As for the remaining 70% of the farm, it would continue operating as you see fit, though with access to any of our technologies you wish to implement. The goal isn't to take over Twin Oaks, Mr. Daniels. It's to help it thrive while advancing research that could benefit family farms everywhere." William, who had been listening attentively, suddenly spoke up. "It would help a lot of people, Mr. Daniels. Dad says if farms like yours disappear, everyone suffers." Wilbur looked at the boy, surprised by the comment. Theodore smiled proudly at his son. "William has been learning about agricultural sustainability in school. It's made quite an impression." Dr. Williams continued, addressing Wilbur's final concern. "Regarding commitment, Morgan Innovations is prepared to establish a 20-year partnership agreement with renewal options thereafter. The terms would include provisions ensuring the farm remains in your ownership regardless of future corporate decisions." And she glanced at Theodore, who nodded encouragingly. "And we're interested in establishing a training program for the next generation of sustainable farmers. Which leads us to another aspect of this proposal." A warning bell sounded in Wilbur's mind. "What aspect?" Theodore took over again, his tone carefully neutral. "We understand your daughter Patricia has become quite accomplished in the field of agricultural science. Her work on drought-resistant crop varieties has been particularly noteworthy." Wilbur's expression closed immediately. "Patricia has her own career. She's not interested in Twin Oaks." "Perhaps," Theodore acknowledged. "But would she be interested in leading a research initiative that could transform family farming practices nationwide? Because that's the position we'd like to offer her, contingent, of course, on your agreement to this partnership." The kitchen fell silent as Wilbur absorbed this unexpected dimension of the proposal. Patricia hadn't set foot on Twin Oaks Farm in nearly 15 years. Their relationship, strained by disagreements that had begun long before Eleanor's death, had worsened in its aftermath. The thought of her returning not as the daughter who had rejected the farming life, but as a scientific authority implementing changes to the land he'd tended for decades, was complex and unsettling. "You haven't spoken to her about this?" Wilbur finally said. It wasn't a question. "No," Theodore confirmed. "We wouldn't approach her without your agreement first. This partnership needs to work for you, Mr. Daniels, or it doesn't work at all." William, sensing the tension, slipped from his chair and moved to the window where Scout had settled. The boy knelt beside the dog, whispering something that made her ears perk up attentively. Wilbur watched the interaction, using the moment to collect his thoughts. The proposition was both more and less than he had expected. Not a simple bailout or purchase offer, but a complex partnership that would fundamentally alter Twin Oaks Farm, while potentially preserving its core identity. And the inclusion of Patricia, whether she would accept or not, added an emotional dimension he hadn't anticipated. "This is a lot to take in," Wilbur finally said. "I'd need to think about it." "Of course," Theodore responded immediately. "We don't expect an immediate decision. Take whatever time you need to consider the proposal." He nodded to Dr. Williams, who placed one of her folders on the table. "This contains the detailed proposal, including financial projections, implementation timelines, and the legal framework of the partnership agreement," she explained. "It also includes contact information if you have questions or concerns." Wilbur eyed the folder without touching it. "And if I say no?" Theodore met his gaze directly. "Then we thank you for your consideration and continue our search for an appropriate partner farm. The foreclosure situation would remain your challenge to address. But please understand, this isn't an attempt to exploit your financial circumstances, Mr. Daniels. It's a genuine business proposition that we believe would benefit both parties." "And the boy?" Wilbur nodded toward William, who was now demonstrating to Scout how to shake hands, a trick the dog had known for years, but was patiently relearning from her new friend. A smile warmed Theodore's expression. "William has developed quite an attachment to Twin Oaks. I suspect he'd be disappointed if our partnership didn't proceed, but he would respect your decision." As if sensing he was the topic of conversation, William looked up. "Mr. Daniels, can I show Scout the thing they brought for her? It's in the car." "What thing?" Wilbur asked, momentarily distracted from the weighty decision before him. "It's a surprise," William replied with the earnestness only a 12-year-old could muster. "Dad said it was okay to bring it." Wilbur nodded his permission, and William dashed outside, Scout following eagerly at his heels. In the momentary lull, Dr. Williams excused herself, sensing that Theodore and Wilbur might benefit from a more private conversation. "Your boy seems taken with the farm," Wilbur observed once they were alone. "Not what I'd expect from a child raised with your resources." Theodore's expression turned reflective. "William's mother, my late wife Dawamanis, grew up on a small farm in Pennsylvania. She always said it was the best childhood a person could have. Fresh air, responsibility, connection to the land." He looked out the window, where William was retrieving something from one of the SUVs. "After she died 2 years ago, I promised myself I'd find ways to give William those experiences, even if they looked different from her childhood." This revelation of shared loss shifted something in Wilbur's perception of Theodore Morgan. Not just a wealthy businessman with a convenient proposition, but a widower trying to honor his wife's memory through their son. It was a motivation Wilbur understood all too well. Eleanor, my wife. She used to say that too, Wilbur admitted. That growing up on a farm taught lessons you couldn't learn anywhere else. Patricia never saw it that way, though. Children often don't appreciate their upbringing until they have more perspective, Theodore offered. Sometimes it takes years, or having children of their own. Wilbur nodded, acknowledging the truth in this observation. Why include Patricia in your proposal? You must have plenty of qualified scientists. We do, Theodore agreed. But family connections matter, Mr. Daniels. If this partnership is going to succeed long-term, having someone with both scientific expertise and a personal stake in Twin Oaks would be invaluable. Whether that personal stake is positive or complicated doesn't change the underlying connection. Before Wilbur could respond to this surprisingly insightful assessment, William burst back into the kitchen cradling a package wrapped in brown paper. Scout followed, her tail wagging with anticipation. "I got this for Scout," William announced, carefully unwrapping the package to reveal a handsome new leather collar with a polished brass nameplate. "To replace the one that got ruined in the water when you saved me?" Wilbur was startled by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Scout's old collar had indeed been damaged beyond repair during the rescue, and he'd been using a piece of rope as a temporary measure, intending to purchase a replacement when finances allowed. "That's mighty considerate," Wilbur said, genuinely touched. "How'd you know her old one was ruined?" William looked pleased by the reaction. "I noticed when we were here before. Dad helped me find a place that makes really good ones that last forever." He knelt beside Scout, showing her the collar. "See, it has your name? And Mr. Daniels's phone number, so if you ever get lost, someone can bring you home." The casual kindness of the gesture, not an extravagant display of wealth, but a practical gift chosen with genuine care, affected Wilbur more deeply than Theodore's elaborate business proposal. It spoke to something essential about both father and son, a decency that transcended their privileged circumstances. Wilbur cleared his throat against a sudden tightness. "Well, let's try it on her then." As William carefully fastened the new collar around Scout's neck, his small fingers working the buckle with concentration, Wilbur caught Theodore's eye over the boy's head. Something unspoken passed between the two men, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that whatever business arrangement might or might not develop between them, a different kind of connection had already been established. "It looks perfect," William declared, stepping back to admire Scout's new accessory. The dog seemed equally pleased, prancing around the kitchen as if aware she was being admired. "Suits her," Wilbur agreed. The simple domestic moment momentarily displaced the weight of decisions that awaited him. "She's a good working dog, deserves proper equipment." Theodore checked his watch with reluctance. "We should probably head back soon, William. Mr. Daniels needs time to consider our proposal, and you have school tomorrow." The boy's disappointment was evident, but he nodded with surprising maturity. "Can I visit Scout again sometime? Even if the business thing doesn't happen?" Wilbur found himself nodding before he'd, consciously decided to do so. "Scout would miss you if you didn't." William's face brightened, and he threw his arms around the border collie in a farewell hug. "I'll be back soon," he promised the dog, who responded with an affectionate lick to his cheek. As they prepared to leave, Theodore handed Wilbur a business card. "My personal number," he explained. "When you've made your decision, whatever it may be, call me directly. No assistants, no gatekeepers." Wilbur accepted the card, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "I'll think on it," he promised. "That's all I can say for now." "That's all I ask," Theodore replied, extending his hand. "Thank you for hearing us out, Mr. Daniels." As the Morgans departed, Wilbur stood on the porch, watching the procession of vehicles wind down his driveway, Scout sitting attentively at his side. The folder containing Morgan Innovations' proposal lay on the kitchen table behind him, unopened, but impossible to ignore. The farm stretched before him, bathed in late afternoon sunlight. The same view his grandfather had contemplated when he first built this house. That his father had surveyed each morning before dawn. That Wilbur himself had watched change through seasons and decades. Twin Oaks Farm had never been just land to the Daniels family. It was identity, purpose, legacy. And now, it stood at a crossroads. Wilbur absently fingered the business card in his pocket, his mind already turning over the possibilities Theodore's proposal presented. Not just financial salvation, though that was significant, but a transformation that might breathe new life into land that had seen increasingly difficult years. And there was Patricia to consider. Would she even want to be involved? Would this create an opportunity to heal what had broken between them or deepen the divide? Scout nudged his hand with her nose, the new collar catching the sunlight, its brass tag gleaming. "What do you think, girl?" Wilbur asked quietly. "Change is coming one way or another. Question is, do we choose it or let it choose us?" Scout had no answers, of course, but her steady presence was comforting as Wilbur contemplated the decision that would determine not just his future, but the future of Twin Oaks Farm for generations to come. With a deep breath, he turned and walked back into the house, Scout at his heels. It was time to take a serious look at what Theodore Morgan was really offering and to make a phone call he'd been avoiding for far too long. That evening, after completing his chores with the mechanical precision of decades-long habit, Wilbur sat at his kitchen table with the Morgan Innovations folder open before him. Scout lay at his feet, occasionally raising her head when Wilbur sighed or mumbled to himself, her new collar gleaming in the lamplight. The proposal was more comprehensive than he'd expected. Page after page of detailed plans, environmental assessments, financial projections, and legal frameworks. Theodore Morgan clearly didn't approach anything halfway. Wilbur removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down upon him. The financial aspects were straightforward enough. Morgan Innovations would clear the existing debt on Twin Oaks Farm, not just the imminent foreclosure amount, but all outstanding loans and tax liens. They would establish an operational fund for immediate infrastructure repairs and ongoing maintenance. Wilbur would receive a monthly stipend as the property manager and research partner, substantially more than the farm had netted in profit for the past decade. In exchange, 30% of the farm's acreage would be dedicated to Morgan's sustainable agriculture research programs. The property would remain in Wilbur's name with contractual agreements for Morgan's use of the designated research areas, a 20-year initial commitment with renewal options that could extend to Wilbur's heirs, presumably Patricia, though the documents delicately avoided specifying. It was the technical aspects that Wilbur found both intriguing and unsettling. Advanced irrigation systems that promised to reduce water usage by 60% while improving crop yields. Soil monitoring equipment that would analyze nutrient needs in real time. A smart greenhouse complex that would combine traditional growing methods with precision environmental controls. The technology wasn't the problem. Wilbur had never been opposed to innovation when it served a practical purpose. What gave him pause was the fundamental shift in Twin Oaks Farm's identity. For 3 generations, it had been a working farm, producing crops and, in better years, modest profits. Under this proposal, it would become something else. Part research facility, part demonstration project, part educational center. Would his father and grandfather recognize what their farm had become? Would they approve? Wilbur closed the folder and moved to the living room window, gazing out at the moonlit fields. The land looked peaceful in the silvery light, its flaws and struggles hidden by darkness. He could almost see it as it had been in his childhood. The orchard in full bloom, the barn freshly painted, the fields bursting with promising crops. A memory surfaced, his father standing in that very spot, watching a new irrigation system being installed in the west field. "Farming changes like everything else, son," James Daniels had said, his weathered face thoughtful. "The ones who survive aren't the ones who farm exactly like their daddies did. They're the ones who take the best of the old ways and marry it to the best of the new." At the time, Wilbur had nodded without fully understanding. Now, 50 years later, his father's words resonated with unexpected clarity. With a deep breath, Wilbur picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used, but had never forgotten. It rang 4 times before a cautious voice answered. "Hello, Patricia?" Wilbur's voice came out gruffer than he intended. "It's your father." A pause, heavy with unspoken history. "Dad, is everything all right? You never call this late." "Everything's fine," he assured her quickly. "Got something I need to discuss with you about the farm." Another pause. "The farm? What about it?" Wilbur hesitated, unsure how to condense Theodore Morgan's complex proposal into a simple explanation. "Had some visitors today, a company called Morgan Innovations. They want to use Twin Oaks for some kind of agricultural research program, sustainable farming technology, that sort of thing." "Morgan Innovations?" Patricia's voice sharpened with interest. "Theodore Morgan's company? How did they find Twin Oaks?" Wilbur hadn't planned to explain the dramatic events that had led to this proposal, preferring to focus on the business aspects, but Patricia's direct question required a direct answer. "Rescued his boy from Fox River Reservoir during the storm last week. Seems Morgan feels he owes me something for it." "You what?" The shock in Patricia's voice was evident. "Dad, that reservoir is dangerous even in good weather. What were you thinking?" The familiar criticisms, that he took unnecessary risks, that he was too stubborn to recognize his limitations, hovered unspoken between them. Arguments they'd had too many times before. "Wasn't much thinking involved," Wilbur replied evenly. "Boy was drowning. I was there. Did what needed doing." A soft exhale came through the line, something between exasperation and grudging respect. "Are you okay? Were you hurt?" "I'm fine, but that's not why I'm calling." Wilbur redirected the conversation firmly. "Morgan wants to transform the farm into some kind of showcase for sustainable agriculture and—" He hesitated, then pushed forward. "They mentioned they might want to offer you a position leading their research program here." The silence that followed was so profound, Wilbur wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "They mentioned me specifically by name?" "Yes. Seem to know all about your work, drought-resistant crops and such. My research has been published in several journals, Patricia said, a hint of pride breaking through her caution. It's not exactly secret, but why would they connect it to Twin Oaks? Wilbur sighed, leaning against the wall. Because you're my daughter. Because this is your heritage, whether you want it or not. The words hung between them, laden with years of tension. Patricia had left Twin Oaks at 18, determined to forge her own path, far from what she'd seen as the crushing limitations of farm life. Her occasional returns had grown less frequent after her mother's death, the gulf between father and daughter widening with each visit. "Dad," Patricia finally said, her tone softening slightly. "The farm was foreclosing. You told me at Christmas there wasn't much hope left." "Still true," Wilbur acknowledged. "Bank's given me 30 days. This Morgan proposal would clear that debt, keep Twin Oaks in the family, but it would change things substantially." "And how do you feel about that?" Patricia asked carefully. "You've never been one for change." The observation stung with its accuracy. "Been thinking about something your grandfather once told me about taking the best of the old ways and marrying it to the best of the new. Maybe this is what he meant." Another silence, this one thoughtful rather than tense. "Would you be staying on the farm? In the house?" "That's the plan. I'd manage the traditional farming operations, advise on the research portions. They're offering a fair stipend for it." "And if I were to consider their offer?" Patricia's voice held a vulnerability Wilbur hadn't heard in years. "Would that work? You and me, trying to run Twin Oaks together after all this time?" It was the question that had been haunting Wilbur since Theodore first mentioned Patricia's potential involvement. Their relationship had deteriorated to the point where holidays were tense, phone calls were rare, and meaningful conversations were almost non-existent. Could they possibly work together day after day with their fundamentally different approaches to life and land? "Don't know," he answered honestly. "But maybe it's worth finding out." Patricia's inhale was audible through the phone. "I'd need to see the proposal. Talk to Morgan directly about what they're envisioning for the research program." "I'll have them send you the materials," Wilbur promised. "But, Patricia, I'm not saying yes to this unless you're genuinely interested, not just in the research opportunity, but in Twin Oaks itself, in what it means to our family." "I never stopped caring about Twin Oaks, Dad," Patricia said quietly. "I just couldn't see a future there. Maybe this changes that." She paused. "Give me a few days to think about it once I've seen the proposal." "Take whatever time you need," Wilbur replied, relief washing over him. It wasn't a commitment, but it was more openness than he dared to hope for. "I'll tell Morgan to contact you directly about the details." After a few more minutes of conversation, awkward but less strained than usual, they said their goodbyes. Wilbur hung up the phone and returned to the kitchen, scout padding faithfully behind him. "Well, that went better than expected," he told the dog, who wagged her tail encouragingly. The next morning, Wilbur drove into Grand View to speak with the one person whose judgment he trusted implicitly on matters of business. Mary Edwards had been Eleanor's closest friend, but she had also been the town's librarian for 40 years and served as an informal financial advisor to half the county. Her modest home behind the library was filled with books on every subject imaginable, and her kitchen had been the site of more honest conversations than most professional counselors' offices. Mary welcomed him with raised eyebrows and fresh coffee. "Twice in 1 week, Wilbur Daniels? To what do I owe this unprecedented social activity?" Wilbur placed the Morgan Innovations folder on her kitchen table. "Need your opinion on something, Mary? Business proposal?" Mary's expression shifted from teasing to serious as she recognized the importance of the request. For the next hour, she reviewed the documents with meticulous attention, occasionally asking Wilbur clarifying questions or making small sounds of interest. Finally, she closed the folder and removed her reading glasses, fixing Wilbur with a penetrating gaze. "This is legitimate," she said simply. "The financial structure is sound, the legal protections are robust, and the research objectives appear genuinely innovative. Theodore Morgan has a reputation for forward-thinking investments, and sustainable agriculture is consistent with his company's recent focus areas." She leaned back in her chair. "But that's not really what you came to ask me, is it?" Wilbur managed a rueful smile. Mary had always been able to see through him. "Wanted to know if you thought I'd be a fool to consider it?" "A fool?" Mary shook her head firmly. "No, Wilbur. A fool would be someone who let pride or fear of change lead them to lose a family legacy when a viable alternative was presented." She reached across the table to touch his hand briefly. "Eleanor would have said yes to this in a heartbeat. You know, she always saw Twin Oaks as evolving, not static." The mention of his late wife sent a familiar pang through Wilbur's chest. "She would have, wouldn't she?" He could almost hear Eleanor's practical voice gently chiding him for hesitating. She had always been the progressive one in their partnership, pushing for innovations that Wilbur would have delayed. "And what about Patricia?" Mary asked gently. "Have you told her?" Wilbur nodded. "Called her last night. She's cautiously interested. Wants to review the proposal herself." Mary's face brightened. "That's wonderful, Wilbur. This could be exactly what you both need. A way to rebuild your relationship around something constructive, something that honors the past, while creating a new future." Her words crystallized something that had been forming in Wilbur's mind since his conversation with Patricia. Twin Oaks Farm had been the source of their estrangement, Patricia seeing it as a burden, a limitation, while Wilbur viewed it as their core identity. Perhaps transforming the farm could transform their relationship as well. "I think I've made my decision," Wilbur said, standing up with new resolution. "Appreciate your time, Mary." Mary smiled, a hint of moisture in her eyes. "Eleanor would be proud, Wilbur, of both of you." Later, dieser Assaders. Efter moi baseder no zeis meines, arvaun. Wilbur stood in the west field, the one his father had irrigated with such forward-thinking optimism half a century before. Scout explored nearby, occasionally flushing a rabbit from the tall grass at the field's edge. The farm stretched around him, beautiful despite its struggles. The fields that had fed his family for generations, the barn where he had played as a child and worked as a man, the twin oak trees that had given the farm its name, planted by his grandfather on the day he purchased the property, now towering sentinels overseeing all that happened below. Could he really agree to change it all? To invite technology and research and outside influence into this private world? The alternative flashed through his mind, bank representatives auctioning the property piece by piece, the house emptied of family history, the land divided and repurposed, perhaps for development rather than agriculture. The Daniels legacy erased as if it had never existed. No. Whatever changes Theodore Morgan's proposal might bring, they would be changes guided by Wilbur's hand, informed by his knowledge, potentially continued by his daughter. Evolution, rather than extinction. Wilbur reached into his pocket for Theodore's business card and his seldom-used cell phone. The number was answered on the second ring. Theodore Morgan. Mr. Morgan, Wilbur Daniels. He paused, looking out over the farm that had defined his entire life. I've made my decision about your proposal. I'm listening, Mr. Daniels. Wilbur took a deep breath, feeling as if he stood on the edge of a great precipice. I'm willing to move forward under two conditions. Name them, Theodore replied, a hint of pleased anticipation in his voice. First, Patricia needs to be genuinely interested in the research position. Not pressured, not persuaded, genuinely interested. This only works if she wants to be here. Understood. And the second condition? Wilbur's gaze settled on the twin oaks, their broad canopies casting dappled shadows across the ground below. The character of this land, its history, its purpose as a working farm has to be respected. Your technology needs to enhance what Twin Oaks is, not replace it. Mr. Daniels, Theodore replied with evident sincerity. Preserving the character and legacy of Twin Oaks Farm is precisely what makes this partnership valuable to us. You have my word that respecting its history will be foundational to our approach. Wilbur nodded, though Theodore couldn't see the gesture. Then I believe we have an agreement. Excellent. Theodore's enthusiasm was evident. I'll have the formal contracts prepared immediately, and with your permission, I'll reach out to Patricia directly about the research position. She's expecting your call, Wilbur confirmed. As they finished their conversation, arranging for Morgan's team to return to Twin Oaks the following week to begin the formal planning process, Wilbur felt an unfamiliar lightness. The burden of imminent financial ruin had lifted, replaced by the very different challenge of guiding Twin Oaks Farm into an unexpected future. Scout returned to his side, panting happily from her exploration. Wilbur knelt, ignoring the protest in his knees, to rub the dog's ears. Change is coming, girl, he told her. Big ones, but we'll face them together. He glanced up at the farmhouse in the distance, imagining it filled with activity again, perhaps even with family. All of us together. The 2 weeks following Wilbur's decision passed in a blur of activity. Surveyors mapped every inch of Twin Oaks Farm. Soil specialists collected samples from each field, and engineers assessed the existing infrastructure with meticulous attention to detail. Through it all, Wilbur observed with a watchful eye, answering questions about the farm's history and offering insights that no amount of technical analysis could provide. The northeast corner floods first, he told a young hydrologist who was examining topographical maps. Always has, even in a moderate rain. My grandfather tried drainage tiles back in the 40s, but they silted up within a year. The scientist looked up with genuine interest. Did he try anything else? Planted willows along the drainage path. In the 50s. Helped some. They're still there. See that line of trees? Their root systems create natural channels. This pattern repeated itself throughout the preliminary assessments. modern scientific methods enhanced by generations of practical knowledge. To Wilbur's surprise, the Morgan team valued his input, often adjusting their plans based on his observations. It wasn't the dismissive takeover he had feared, but a respectful collaboration that acknowledged the wisdom embedded in Twin Oaks' history. Sheriff Jack Wilson stopped by midweek, ostensibly to check on storm recovery, but clearly curious about the sudden activity at the farm. "Quite the operation you've got going," he remarked, watching a drone survey the western fields. "Word around town is that you've partnered with Theodore Morgan himself." Wilbur nodded, offering no elaboration. Jack studied his old friend's face. "Happy with your decision so far?" "They listen," Wilbur allowed. "That counts for something." Jack smiled, recognizing the significant concession in those simple words. "Mary Edwards is telling everyone who will listen that this is the best thing to happen to Forestdale County in 50 years. Says it could revitalize the whole agricultural community." Wilbur raised an eyebrow. "Mary's getting ahead of herself?" "Maybe," Jack acknowledged. "Or maybe she sees potential that the rest of us are just beginning to understand." He clapped Wilbur on the shoulder. "Either way, it's good to see Twin Oaks getting a second chance. Place means a lot to this community." As Jack departed, Wilbur pondered his words. He'd always viewed Twin Oaks as a private kingdom, his family's land, his responsibility. The idea that it held significance beyond its boundaries, that its survival mattered to the wider community, was both uncomfortable and oddly gratifying. On Friday afternoon, Dr. Sophia Williams arrived with news that Patricia had accepted the research director position and would be arriving the following Monday to begin the transition. She had a lot of questions about the scope of the project, Dr. Williams told Wilbur as they walked the perimeter of what would become the main research area. "Very thorough, very knowledgeable. She's already suggested some modifications to our initial plans that would better integrate traditional farming methods with our technology." Wilbur felt a complex mix of emotions at this report. Pride in Patricia's expertise, anxiety about their imminent reunion, and a cautious hope that perhaps this new chapter might heal old wounds. "Does she know she'll be living here at the farmhouse?" This detail hadn't been explicitly discussed in his brief conversation with Patricia. Dr. Williams nodded. "She asked about accommodation options. We offered to arrange something in Grand View, but she said she'd prefer to stay at Twin Oaks, at least initially, if that's acceptable to you, of course." The thought of sharing the farmhouse with Patricia after so many years of solitude was daunting. The spaces Eleanor had once filled with warmth and mediation between father and daughter now stood empty. Would the old tensions resurface immediately, or had time and circumstance created room for a new understanding? "It's her home, too," Wilbur said simply. "Always has been." Monday morning arrived with unnerving swiftness. Wilbur rose before dawn, as was his habit, and completed his chores with mechanical efficiency, his mind elsewhere. He'd spent the weekend preparing Patricia's old room, mothballed for years, but preserved like a museum exhibit to a departed childhood. Fresh linens on the bed, dust banished from surfaces. The curtains Eleanor had sewn decades ago freshly laundered and rehung. Physical tasks to occupy his hands, while his thoughts churned with uncertainty. At precisely 10:00 a.m., a fleet of vehicles appeared on the horizon, winding their way up the long driveway to Twin Oaks. Wilbur counted 10 in total, the same number as Theodore's initial visit, though the composition was different this time. 8 black SUVs identical to the previous convoy, followed by a moving truck, and at the rear, a modest blue sedan that Wilbur instantly recognized as Patricia's car. Scout, who'd been dozing on the porch, stood alert as the vehicles approached, her tail wagging tentatively, as if uncertain whether to welcome or warn. "It's all right, girl," Wilbur murmured, though his own tension belied the reassurance. The vehicles parked in a neat formation before the farmhouse. From the lead SUV emerged Theodore Morgan, dressed more casually than during his previous visit, but still exuding the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command. William bounded out immediately after, his face breaking into a delighted grin at the sight of Wilbur and Scout. "Mr. Daniels, Scout!" the boy called, rushing forward as Scout trotted down the porch steps to meet him. "We're back, and this time we're staying for 2 whole weeks." Wilbur felt a smile tugging at his lips, despite his nervousness. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious. "That's so. Scout will be pleased to hear it." Theodore approached more sedately, extending his hand. "Mr. Daniels, thank you for your hospitality. I hope our advance team hasn't been too disruptive to your routine." "Been fine," Wilbur assured him, shaking the offered hand. His gaze drifted past Theodore to the blue sedan, where a figure was just emerging. Patricia Daniels stood beside her car, surveying the farm with an expression Wilbur couldn't quite interpret. At 43, she resembled Eleanor more than ever. The same determined set to her jaw, the same observant eyes that missed nothing. Her business attire looked out of place against the rural backdrop, a visual reminder of the different world she had chosen. For a moment, father and daughter simply looked at each other across the yard, 15 years of estrangement condensed into a single, loaded glance. Then Patricia squared her shoulders and walked forward, extending her hand formally as if Wilbur were a colleague rather than her father. "Dad," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "The farm looks good." Wilbur accepted her hand, noting the calluses that suggested her work wasn't entirely confined to laboratories. "Patricia," he hesitated, then added, "good to have you home." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at this small concession. "It's strange to be back," she admitted. "Everything looks the same but different, too." Before Wilbur could respond, William appeared at his side, Scout following attentively. "You must be Miss Daniels," the boy said with the direct confidence of childhood. "I'm William Morgan. Your dad saved my life." Patricia blinked, momentarily thrown by the boy's forthright introduction. "Yes, I heard about that. It's nice to meet you, William." "Scout remembers me," William announced proudly as the border collie pressed against his leg affectionately. "Dad says I can help with her training while we're here. Mr. Daniels said it was okay." Patricia glanced at Wilbur, a question in her eyes. "Boy's good with animals," Wilbur explained with a slight shrug. "Scout's taken to him." This simple exchange, the acknowledgement that Wilbur had approved William's involvement with the dog, that the boy had been welcomed into a small corner of Twin Oaks' life, seemed to reassure Patricia somehow. Her posture relaxed fractionally. "Well, Scout's always been a good judge of character," she said, offering William a genuine smile. "Maybe you can introduce me to the new chickens later. I hear they've replaced the ones I knew." As the conversation continued, the remaining vehicles disgorged their occupants. Dr. Williams and her scientific team, administrative staff, security personnel, and equipment specialists. The quiet farmyard transformed into a hive of activity, with introductions being made, equipment being unloaded, and plans being discussed. Theodore gathered everyone together on the front lawn, creating an impromptu assembly beneath the ancient oak tree that had witnessed 3 generations of Daniels' family history. "Today marks the beginning of an extraordinary partnership," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd. "Twin Oaks Farm and Morgan,